The restaurant was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small. Every table was draped in white linen, every glass sparkled, and every conversation seemed to whisper money. The air was filled with the scent of truffle butter and the soft sound of piano music drifting from the corner of the room. It wasn't the kind of place where mistakes were forgiven easily. Every movement had to be graceful, every smile polite, every word spoken softly. Among the polished silver and designer suits moved a young woman wearing a plain black uniform. She carried plates, refilled glasses, and thanked guests with quiet patience. Her shoes pinched her feet, her back ached, but she never showed it. To most of the guests, she was invisible, just another part of the background, like the candles or the music. Her shift had started hours ago, and she still had several more to go. She had learned to move quickly without drawing attention. She knew how to read moods, how to appear cheerful even when exhaustion clung to her bones. Every day was the same, and until that night. The crowd that evening was different. A large group had reserved the private section near the piano. They weren't the kind of people who came for the food. They came to be seen. Their laughter filled the room, too loud, too confident. They ordered the most expensive items on the menu, complained about the temperature of the wine, and treated the staff like they were invisible. Still, she kept her calm. She had learned long ago that dignity didn't come from money. It came from patience. But inside she was tired. Tired of pretending not to hear the snide comments. Tired of forcing a smile when people waved her off like a servant. The pianist that night was an older man who had played at the restaurant for years. His music usually kept the room soft and elegant, but even he seemed distracted. During a short break, he stepped away from the piano to take a phone call, leaving the room filled only with the hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware. That's when one of the men from the private table noticed the piano sitting empty. He was tall, dressed in a sharp navy suit, his voice smooth but edged with arrogance. "Well," he said loud enough for the room to hear, "it looks like our music's gone silent. Maybe someone here can play for us." A few people at his table laughed. Another woman, dripping in diamonds, added, "Maybe one of the staff? I'm sure they'd love to entertain us." The laughter grew. It wasn't cruel in the way shouting is cruel, and it was worse. It was the kind of laughter that made people feel small without saying anything directly. The waitress froze for a second, holding a tray of glasses. She pretended not to hear, but the man's eyes had already found her. "You there?" he said, pointing playfully. "You've been moving around that piano all night. You must have picked up a few notes, right?" A few chuckles rippled through the tables nearby. The attention made her heart race. She smiled politely, the way she had been trained, and replied softly, "I'm sorry, sir, but I just served the tables." That only made them laugh louder. "Oh, come on," the man continued. "Don't be shy. We're just having a bit of fun. Sit down and show us what you've got." She felt the heat rise to her face. Her hands tightened around the tray, but she didn't move. She knew how quickly these moments could turn ugly if she said the wrong thing. Another man leaned back in his chair and said, "Let her try. It'll be amusing." The piano sat in the corner, shining under the dim light, its keys waiting. She looked at it for a moment. That instrument she had once loved more than anything. She hadn't touched one in years. Life had gotten in the way, and dreams didn't pay bills. The memory hit her like a soft ache. She used to play every day when she was younger. There was a time when her fingers danced across the keys with ease, when music had been her whole world. But things had changed. She remembered her mother's tired hands after long shifts, her soft voice saying, "One day you'll play on big stages." But her mother had gotten sick, and everything she'd saved for school had gone to hospital bills. Music became a luxury she couldn't afford. Now, standing there in a restaurant full of strangers, being mocked for something that once brought her joy, she felt that ache again. She could have ignored them. She could have walked away. But something deep inside her whispered that maybe it was time to stop hiding. She set the tray down carefully on a nearby table and took a breath. "All right," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "Just for a moment." The laughter faded a little. The arrogant man smirked. "That's the spirit," he said. "Let's see what the waitress can do." She walked toward the piano slowly. Every step felt heavy. She could feel every eye in the room following her. The other waiters paused in their work. The manager frowned from a distance, unsure what was happening. When she reached the piano, she ran her fingers lightly over the polished surface. The keys were smooth, cold. She sat down on the bench, and for a moment she just stared at them. It had been years since she last played, but her fingers remembered. Muscle memory never really fades. The crowd watched in silence now. What had started as a joke had turned into something else, something none of them expected. The arrogance in their laughter had been replaced by a strange curiosity. She closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, the world around her disappeared. The noise, the faces, the pressure, and all of it faded away. It was just her and the piano again, like when she was a child. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She took a deep breath and pressed the first note. The sound that came out was soft but clear, a single tone that hung in the air like a memory. It was followed by another and another. The notes came slow at first, uncertain, as if she were testing the water. Then, as her confidence returned, her hands began to move with grace. The melody that filled the room wasn't loud or showy. It was gentle, filled with emotion, a tune that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. The kind of sound that silenced everything around it. At first, the people watched out of amusement. But then something shifted. The laughter stopped. The arrogance on their faces began to fade, replaced by disbelief. The music wasn't something they could mock. It carried too much feeling, too much truth. Each note spoke of loss and hope, of nights spent working instead of dreaming, of quiet strength. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. In the back of the room, one of the chefs poked his head out from the kitchen, drawn by the sound. The manager stood frozen, unsure whether to stop her or let her continue. The older guests sat motionless, their eyes softening. The man who had mocked her earlier leaned forward, his smirk gone. He didn't understand how someone serving drinks could play like that. It didn't fit the picture he had built in his head, but she didn't see any of that. Her eyes stayed closed, her heart moving with the rhythm. Every touch of the keys brought her closer to the part of herself she thought she had lost. For a moment, she wasn't a waitress anymore. She was simply someone who loved music. When she reached the final notes, her hands slowed until the last sound faded into silence. She opened her eyes, breathing softly. The room was utterly still, no one spoke. For a long, heavy moment, all that existed was the echo of her song. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. It started with a single person, one of the guests at another table. Then another joined, and another, until the whole room erupted in applause. The same people who had laughed now stood to their feet. She sat there in quiet disbelief, her hands resting on the keys. The rush of emotion filled her chest. She didn't play for praise or attention. She played because she had to, because for once she wanted to remind herself that she was more than just a uniform. As the clapping grew louder, she stood up, gave a small nod, and returned to her work. But something had changed. The same people who once looked through her now looked at her differently. Behind the counter, one of the other servers whispered, "I had no idea you could play like that." She smiled softly. "I almost forgot I could." The pianist returned from his break a few minutes later, puzzled by the energy in the room. When he asked what happened, one of the guests told him, still amazed, "The waitress played." He looked over at her with surprise, then at the piano, then back again. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess I've been replaced." She laughed, shaking her head. "Not at all," she said. "Just borrowing your seat for a minute." He nodded with respect. "You should borrow it more often." As she walked away to serve another table, the guests were still talking about her. They didn't know her story, or the years she had spent hiding her gift, or how hard her life had been. But they felt something that couldn't be explained, and something real. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Not as a waitress, but as a person. As someone who had more to offer than anyone in that room had ever expected. That night, as the restaurant closed and the lights dimmed, she sat at the empty piano once more. She played a few quiet notes just for herself. The sound filled the quiet space like a promise, that no matter how far she drifted from her dreams, music would always find a way back to her, and she smiled, knowing that something had begun to change. The next day began like any other, with the restaurant buzzing as early patrons trickled in and the staff prepared for a busy lunch. She moved quickly between tables, carrying plates and glasses, her mind still replaying the previous night. The memory of the piano, the way the notes had flowed through the room, and the shocked faces of the guests stayed with her. Even in the midst of her usual routine, she felt a quiet warmth inside, a reminder that something inside her had shifted. Yet, as she worked, she also felt a small knot of fear in her chest. People had watched her play last night, and though the applause had been genuine, the world she served in rarely welcomed anyone stepping out of their expected role. She knew that some guests would whisper, some would scoff, and some would see her as nothing more than a curiosity. Her boss, a stern woman who valued efficiency over flair, approached her with a clipboard in hand. "I heard about last night," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "Impressive, I suppose, but remember your duties come first. Don't let anything distract you from serving." She nodded, keeping her face calm. "Of course." Inside, though, she was already thinking about the piano. The way her fingers had moved over the keys, the sound that had come from them, even the feeling of being completely in the moment. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in years. The thought of sitting there again, this time without the weight of expectation, made her pulse quicken. When the lunch rush began, she put her thoughts aside and focused on her work. Orders flew in, glasses needed refilling, and plates were constantly moving from kitchen to table. The routine was exhausting but familiar, a rhythm that allowed her to push aside her lingering excitement. She smiled, poured, served, and cleared, moving with efficiency honed over years. Midway through the service, the same group from the previous night arrived again, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. The wealthy patrons were louder, more confident, and clearly in a mood for entertainment. She felt her stomach tighten, the memory of last night's applause now mingling with anxiety. One of the men, the same one who had dared her to play the piano, spotted her immediately. His eyes gleamed with mischief as he leaned back in his chair. "Ah, there she is. The pianist. Come join us. Don't be shy," he called out loud enough for several nearby tables to hear. The room fell into a brief silence, all eyes turning toward her. She froze for a moment, unsure whether to respond. The tray in her hand suddenly felt heavy. She had a choice: ignore them, walk away, or face the piano again. Her mind flashed back to last night, to the feeling of her music filling the room, and she knew she couldn't turn away. She set the tray down, her hands shaking slightly, and walked toward the piano once more. The group watched her, some with amusement, some with curiosity, and some with genuine interest. When she sat down on the bench, the piano keys cold under her fingertips, she felt a familiar surge of nerves mixed with excitement. The first note was hesitant, almost shy, but it quickly gave way to confidence. She began to play slowly at first, letting the melody find its own pace. The music was gentle, filled with emotion, and it moved through the room in a way that silenced every conversation. Guests who had scoffed moments before now leaned forward, captivated by the sound. The man who had challenged her last night sat in stunned silence, realizing that she wasn't just entertaining them, she was speaking through the music. As her fingers danced over the keys, she felt herself letting go of fear and doubt. Each note became a small act of courage, each chord a statement of who she really was. The restaurant, with its chandeliers, polished floors, and expensive wine, faded into the background. It was just her and the piano, and the music that had been waiting inside her for so long. She could feel the tension in the room easing as the music continued. The wealthy guests, used to commanding attention and being in control, now had no choice but to listen. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by awe and wonder. Even the staff, usually busy with their tasks, paused to watch her. One of the older patrons, a woman who rarely showed emotion, had tears welling in her eyes. Another guest, a man who had been scrolling on his phone, put it down and listened intently. The music was reaching them in ways words never could, connecting to something deep inside. She played longer than she had expected, letting the melody flow naturally, without worrying about time or judgment. Each note carried a piece of her story, the years she had spent working hard, the sacrifices she had made, and the dreams she had almost forgotten. The piano became her voice, expressing everything she had kept hidden. When she finally reached the last chord, the room held its breath. The silence was powerful, heavy with emotion. Then slowly the applause began. It started softly, almost hesitantly, but it grew louder with each clap. Guests who had mocked her before now rose to their feet, cheering and clapping, unable to contain their amazement. She sat back, her hands resting on the keys, breathing heavily. The energy in the room was electric. The same people who had tried to humiliate her were now honoring her talent, unable to ignore the truth of what they had just witnessed. The man who had called her over leaned forward, his face a mixture of shock and respect. I didn't expect that," he said, his voice softer than before. "You're incredible," she smiled faintly, nodding politely. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm despite the rush of emotion inside her. The pianist, returning from his break, watched in surprise. He had been playing in this restaurant for years, but he had never seen anyone command attention like this. "Well," he said quietly, "that was something special." She shrugged, still catching her breath. "Just sharing a bit of music," she said. After the performance, she returned to her duties, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests who had previously ignored her now treated her with a new level of respect. Some whispered among themselves, clearly impressed. The staff smiled, recognizing that something extraordinary had happened. Throughout the rest of the evening, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She had faced the challenge, stepped into a moment of fear, and discovered that she was capable of more than she had realized. The piano had become a bridge between her world and theirs, a way to connect that words alone could never achieve. As the restaurant emptied and the lights dimmed, she sat by the piano one more time. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not to play for anyone else but for herself. She let her hands move slowly, playing a few soft notes that filled the quiet room. The sound was soothing, a reminder that she still had this gift, that she still had a voice, and that she could choose to use it whenever she wanted. She knew that the challenge wasn't over. There would be more nights like this, more moments where she might be tested, more people who underestimated her. But she also knew that she had passed the first real test. She had faced the gaze of judgment, the sneers of mockery, and had emerged with her dignity intact. The music she played was no longer just a memory of what could have been. It was alive, a testament to resilience and courage. She realized that the piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a mirror, reflecting her strength back to her in a way that nothing else could. She closed the lid gently, taking one last look around the empty restaurant. The tables were cleared, the chairs neatly arranged, and the chandeliers dimmed to a soft glow. It was ordinary again, just another night ending in a busy city. But for her, the night had changed everything. She walked to the back, her steps lighter than before. Her uniform still pressed and plain, her shoes still tight, but inside she felt different. She had been reminded that her worth wasn't defined by where she worked or what people thought of her. It was defined by what she carried inside. Her courage, her talent, and her willingness to step forward even when the world expected her to stay silent. As she hung up her apron and prepared to leave, she glanced once more at the piano. It sat quietly in the corner, waiting, patient and unjudging. She knew she would return to it again and again, each time discovering something new about herself. The challenge had begun the night before, and she had met it. The room full of judgmental eyes had been silenced, not by force, not by anger, but by something far more powerful: honesty, passion, and music. And she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of her journey. She walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air, the city alive around her. Cars honked, streetlights glowed, and the distant hum of life filled her ears. But inside she carried a melody, a quiet song of triumph that no one could take away. For the first time in years, she felt seen, truly seen, and she smiled, knowing that the next time the piano called, she would answer, not for applause, not for recognition, but for herself. The evening began quietly, with the soft hum of the city outside and the gentle clinking of glasses inside the restaurant. She moved along the tables, refilling water, taking orders, and carrying plates with practiced ease. Her mind, however, kept drifting to the piano. The memory of the previous night's music was vivid, the way the notes had floated across the room, lingering long after her fingers had left the keys. It had been exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Tonight, the restaurant had a special event, a gathering of a select group of patrons who prided themselves on sophistication and taste. They were the kind of people who believed they had seen everything, experienced everything, and rarely found themselves surprised. She had served some of them before. They were polite enough but distant, always evaluating, always comparing. The piano stood in the corner as usual, polished and gleaming under the dim lights. Its keys beckoned to her, familiar and yet intimidating after so many years of absence. She had avoided touching it in public since last night, but now, hearing it fill the room with its presence, she felt a pull she couldn't ignore. Midway through the evening, the pianist had taken a short break. This was the moment. She had walked past the piano countless times before, her hands itching to touch the keys, but tonight something inside her felt different. She knew she could not ignore it. A man at one of the tables, noticing the empty piano, leaned forward with a smirk. "It seems quiet over there," he said loudly. "Perhaps someone can fill the room with music." His words were light, teasing even, but she felt the weight of expectation in the glance he threw her. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could have ignored him. She could have smiled politely and moved on. But instead she felt a strange sense of courage rising in her. She walked toward the piano slowly, each step measured. The murmurs of the patrons faded into the background as the space around her seemed to quiet. She took a deep breath and sat on the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. The first note she played was soft, almost tentative, but it carried through the room with clarity. It was a single note, pure and resonant, that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. She pressed another and then another, and the melody began to take shape. It was a simple tune at first, one that didn't demand attention, but slowly drew it. Her fingers moved naturally, as if they had never stopped playing, and the music began to fill the room. There was a hush over the guests. The laughter and chatter that had accompanied her approach vanished, replaced by a stunned silence. The man who had called her over earlier leaned forward, his expression changing from amusement to disbelief. He had expected something ordinary, perhaps even clumsy, but what he heard now was anything but. Her music had a depth he hadn't anticipated, a feeling that seemed to reach directly to him and the others in the room. She played on, letting the melody flow from her without thought, without fear. Her fingers moved with precision, yet the music was full of emotion, every note carrying a piece of her story. She had not planned this performance. It wasn't a show. It was simply a conversation between her and the piano, and the audience could only listen. Patrons who had come expecting entertainment for amusement found themselves caught off guard. The older guests, accustomed to control and propriety, were leaning forward, their eyes softening. Even those who had been distracted or indifferent were now fully absorbed. The music was reaching them in a way that words never could. She could feel the energy in the room shift. What had been playful teasing turned into a quiet respect, an acknowledgement of her talent and courage. She played not to impress, not to gain attention, but because she had to. The music demanded it, and she obeyed, letting her heart guide her hands. The melody grew more complex, her fingers gliding across the keys with confidence. Each chord carried emotion, a mixture of joy, sorrow, longing, and hope. The patrons, many of whom had come with a sense of superiority, were now silent witnesses to something profoundly human. They could not help but be affected. Some of the staff paused in their work to watch, drawn in by the beauty of the sound. The chef, who rarely ventured into the dining area, stood at the doorway for a moment, mesmerized. Even the manager, usually vigilant and strict, watched silently, impressed by the transformation in the room. She had expected nerves, expected trembling hands and missed notes. But once the music began, all of that vanished. The piano had become an extension of herself, a voice that spoke for the part of her that had been silent for so long. Every note was a reminder of years spent practicing in secret, of nights when the city slept and she alone sat at a piano in a tiny apartment, lost in sound. The guests, now completely engaged, leaned closer. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others held their hands to their hearts as if the melody had touched something deep inside. The room, once filled with chatter and the casual noise of dining, was now united in a shared experience. She noticed the man who had teased her the previous night. His face was different now, the smirk replaced by something like awe. He had underestimated her, assumed she was just a server, someone without talent or depth. Now he realized that the woman sitting before the piano was far more than appearances suggested. She continued, letting the melody grow and swell. There were moments of quiet reflection in the tune, soft passages that made the room hold its breath, and moments of power that made everyone lean forward in anticipation. She lost track of time, completely absorbed in the music. It was in that moment, fully immersed, that she understood something important. The piano was not just an instrument, it was a bridge. It connected her to others in a way that nothing else could. It spoke of human emotions, of experiences and dreams in a language everyone could understand. She realized that this was why she had never truly stopped playing. Music was not a luxury, it was a necessity, a lifeline. The room seemed to change around her. The chandeliers glowed softly, the silverware caught the light, and the guests sat captivated, unable to look away. Even the harshest critics among them were silent, forced to acknowledge the power of what they were hearing. The music transcended the usual barriers, wealth, status, expectation, and spoke directly to the human heart. When she finally reached the final notes, she allowed them to linger, soft and fading as if reluctant to leave. The room held a collective breath, waiting, unsure if it was over. And then slowly the silence was broken by applause. It started as a single clap from the back, hesitant but genuine. Then another joined and another until the entire room erupted in appreciation. The same people who had mocked her just minutes before were now standing, cheering and clapping, unable to contain their astonishment. Tears filled the eyes of some, and smiles spread across faces that had moments ago been set in amusement or skepticism. She sat for a moment, her hands resting on the keys, breathing heavily, still absorbing the intensity of the reaction. The music had been hers alone, yet it had reached so many others, touching them in ways she could not fully understand. The man who had challenged her leaned forward, his voice soft and sincere. I didn't know you could do that," he admitted. "It's incredible." She smiled quietly, a mix of humility and quiet pride. "Thank you," she said simply, letting the moment speak for itself. Even the pianist, returning from his break, was stunned. He had played in this restaurant for years, yet he had never witnessed anything like this. "Well," he said, shaking his head in amazement, "that was extraordinary." She nodded, a small smile on her face. "Just sharing what I love," she replied. The music had changed the room, even if only for a moment. It reminded everyone present that talent and passion can emerge in the most unexpected places, that appearances can be misleading, and that human expression can never be fully predicted. As she returned to her duties, her steps felt lighter. The room was abuzz again, but in a different way. Not with mockery, not with arrogance, but with admiration. Guests whispered to one another, some asking questions about her background, some clearly reflecting on the unexpected display of talent. She continued serving, moving from table to table, but inside she felt a shift she could not ignore. Something had awakened within her, a recognition of her own worth, a reaffirmation of her capabilities, and a newfound understanding that she could step into moments of fear and uncertainty and emerge stronger. The piano, quiet once more, seemed to smile back at her. She knew it would always be there, waiting, patient and unjudging, ready to allow her to speak when words were not enough. The first note had been tentative, a small test, but it had led to something far greater, a connection, a revelation, and a reminder that courage could transform even the most ordinary space into something extraordinary. She left the restaurant that night feeling different. The city lights glimmered around her as she walked home, and the distant sounds of traffic and life seemed softer, almost musical. Inside, she carried a melody, a quiet song of triumph and hope, one that she knew she could revisit whenever she needed. And she smiled, understanding that the first note had been more than just a sound. It had been a declaration, a promise to herself that she would never again underestimate her own strength, her own passion, or the power of simply daring to try. The room had changed. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but the shift was undeniable. Just moments ago, the guests had been full of casual chatter, polite smiles, and a quiet air of superiority. Now everything felt different. Their laughter had faded, replaced by an intense focus and almost electric curiosity. The music had done more than fill the space. It had transformed it. She sat back for a moment, letting the last notes linger in the air. The echo of the piano seemed to carry with it a kind of magic, a quiet power that demanded attention. The guests, still seated but now leaning forward slightly, looked at her with expressions she had never seen before. There was awe, yes, but also a kind of humility. They were witnessing something that was beyond their expectations, beyond their assumptions, beyond the polite theater of the restaurant itself. The man who had dared her to play leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His usual confident smirk was gone. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on her as if trying to understand how someone so seemingly ordinary could create something so extraordinary. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, but no words came. He realized quickly that no compliment, no praise, no remark could fully capture what had just happened. Across the room, others were shifting as well. A woman who had been quietly sipping her wine now had tears glistening in her eyes. She dabbed at them with a napkin, but her gaze never left the young woman at the piano. Even the staff had paused in their duties, frozen for a moment in awe of what they had just witnessed. The kitchen's usual rhythm of sizzling pans and clattering pots seemed distant, as if the world itself had slowed down to listen. For the young woman, the effect of the music was almost overwhelming. She could feel it in the air, in the way it pressed gently against her skin, in the way the room itself seemed to lean in closer. This was not a performance for applause or recognition. It was a moment of connection. She could sense that the guests were no longer merely observers. They were participants in something fragile and extraordinary. Her hands hovered over the keys again, almost instinctively. Though the song had ended, the silence that followed demanded a continuation, not of notes but of presence. She let her fingers trail lightly across the keys, producing soft, tentative sounds that were more like whispers than music. The room responded in kind, its collective breath held, the tension of disbelief giving way to quiet anticipation. The man who had challenged her finally found his voice. "I don't understand," he said slowly, almost to himself. How can someone play like that?" She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. "I suppose some things just can't be explained," she replied softly. Her voice was calm, humble, but there was strength behind it. It wasn't arrogance or defiance, it was simple truth. Around the room, murmurs began to rise, hesitant at first, then stronger. Patrons were whispering to each other, sharing astonishment, sharing disbelief. "Did you hear that?" one said. "That was incredible." Another added, "Where did she learn to play like that?" And yet, beneath all the whispers, there was a deeper recognition. It wasn't just skill that had impressed them. It was courage, it was honesty, it was the vulnerability of someone stepping out of their expected role and showing their true self. It was a reminder that talent often hides in unexpected places, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be contained. The young woman let her hands rest gently on the keys, taking a slow breath. She had expected attention, perhaps even admiration, but what she felt now was something far more profound. The room had been transformed, not by wealth, not by status, not by the chandeliers or fine wine, but by something human, something real. The music had stripped away the layers of pretense and expectation, revealing a shared humanity beneath it all. One of the guests, an older man with a carefully groomed mustache, leaned forward and said quietly, "I've been to many performances, heard many musicians, but none of them touched me like that." Another guest nodded. "It wasn't just the notes," she said softly. "It was everything behind them. The feeling, the honesty. It's rare to witness something like that." Even the man who had teased her moments before seemed changed. He was quiet now, reflective, no longer the confident provocateur he had been. The realization had dawned on him that the young woman in front of him was not a figure of amusement, but a force of nature, gentle yet undeniable. He realized that he had underestimated her entirely, and in that underestimation he had found humility. The young woman felt the shift in the room deeply. She had always known that music had power, but seeing it unfold in this way was almost overwhelming. The guests' attention, the quiet awe, the subtle changes in posture and expression. It was all evidence of something far larger than herself. It was proof that art, no matter how small or unexpected, could reach people in ways that words alone could never accomplish. She allowed herself a small smile, not for the applause, but for the understanding that had passed between her and the room. The music had spoken and the room had listened. It was a moment that could not be replicated, a moment that existed purely because she had dared to step forward. Slowly, she stood, her hands brushing lightly over the keys one last time. She turned to face the room, her posture relaxed but confident. The guests were still seated, but their eyes followed her, filled with curiosity and respect. There was no laughter, no mockery, only acknowledgement of the extraordinary display they had just witnessed. One of the guests, a woman wearing a long, elegant scarf, leaned toward her companion and whispered, "Do you realize how brave she is? To play like that in front of all of us." Her companion nodded. "Yes," he replied softly, "and to do it so effortlessly. It's not just talent, it's courage." The young woman returned to her duties, moving among the tables with the same care as before, but now there was a subtle difference in her step. She felt lighter, freer, as if the music had lifted something from her shoulders. She served dishes and refilled glasses, but she carried within her a quiet pride, a reminder that she had touched lives without intending to, simply by being herself. Guests who had been skeptical, who had come expecting entertainment, were now talking quietly among themselves. They shared their impressions, their astonishment, their reflections. Some approached her later, offering compliments, asking questions, wanting to know more about her background. She responded with her usual humility, grateful for their words, but careful to stay grounded. Even the staff noticed the change. Fellow waiters gave her subtle nods of approval. The kitchen team paused to watch her move with confidence, and the manager, who had always emphasized efficiency over everything else, seemed to regard her with a newfound respect. As the evening wore on, she found herself drawn back to the piano, standing before it in a quiet moment when no one was watching. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant but eager. She pressed one gently, then another, letting the sound fill the empty corner of the room. The notes were soft, personal, a continuation not meant for anyone else but herself. It was in that private moment that she realized how much she had changed. The music had always been part of her, but tonight it had taken on a new significance. It was no longer just an escape, a hobby, or a dream deferred. It was a tool of connection, a means of speaking truths that could not be put into words. The room, transformed by her presence and her music, was now a testament to something larger, the quiet, persistent power of human courage. The guests had come expecting spectacle, expecting amusement, expecting nothing truly extraordinary. Instead, they had witnessed authenticity, vulnerability, and the undeniable force of talent paired with bravery. She understood now that this was just the beginning. The music had opened doors not just in the room around her but within herself. It had shown her that stepping forward, even in the face of doubt and potential embarrassment, could lead to transformation, not just for her but for everyone who encountered her. When the night finally came to a close and the last guests had departed, she sat alone by the piano, the room silent except for the faint echoes of her earlier performance. She allowed herself to reflect, to feel the weight of what had happened, and to understand the significance of her courage. This was more than just a successful performance. It was a reminder that human expression, when combined with honesty and bravery, could break through assumptions, prejudice, and preconceptions. It could touch people in ways that nothing else could, and it could change lives, even if only for a moment. As she closed the piano lid and walked to the back of the restaurant, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment and peace. She had faced the challenge, and the room had responded, not with mockery, not with indifference, but with genuine recognition. She had transformed the space with nothing more than music and the willingness to share herself fully. The city outside continued on, unaware of the small miracle that had occurred inside. The streets hummed with life, lights flickered, and cars passed by. But inside that quiet corner, something had shifted. The young woman had discovered her own strength, and in doing so, had opened the eyes and hearts of those around her. She left the restaurant that night carrying more than just the memory of her performance. She carried confidence, courage, and the knowledge that her voice, through the piano, could reach others in profound ways. And she knew that the transformation she had witnessed in the room was only the beginning of a journey that would continue to unfold in countless ways, touching lives far beyond what she could imagine. The days that followed were unlike anything she had experienced before. Word of her performance spread quietly at first, through whispers among patrons and compliments passed along by staff. But soon the story grew beyond the walls of the restaurant. People who had attended that night spoke of the waitress who had silenced a room full of the city's wealthiest, of the music that seemed to reach straight into their hearts. Some shared the tale on social media, describing the astonishing scene with awe. She tried to go about her normal life, moving through her shifts as she always had, but nothing felt quite the same. Each step through the restaurant carried a new awareness, a subtle confidence that she hadn't felt before. The piano in the corner, once just a fixture, now seemed like a friend waiting for her, an invitation she could no longer resist. Even the staff treated her differently. The younger servers looked at her with quiet admiration, a kind of respect that was unspoken but deeply felt. The older staff, who had long worked alongside her, nodded approvingly whenever she passed, acknowledging something they had only recently recognized. She was extraordinary, in ways that went far beyond serving tables. The man who had first called her over to the piano returned several times over the next week. Each time he watched her closely, unable to hide the astonishment in his expression. There was no teasing now, only curiosity and respect. He never said much, just observed, as if trying to understand how someone so seemingly ordinary could hold such power within them. One evening, as the restaurant was quieting down, the pianist returned for his usual shift. He approached her cautiously, a small smile on his face. "I heard what happened while I was gone," he said softly. "I didn't think anyone could." "Well, move a room like that." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "I just played what I felt," she replied. "I never expected any of this." He nodded. "It's more than playing. You reached people. You made them feel something real. That's rare. Most musicians never get to do that. Not truly." For the first time, she allowed herself to fully absorb the weight of what had happened. The applause, the stunned silence, the changed expressions of the patrons. It wasn't just about talent. It was about courage, about daring to step forward when all eyes were watching, about being willing to share a piece of yourself without knowing the outcome. The weeks passed and more patrons requested that she play. Some came hoping to witness the magic they had heard about, while others simply wanted to hear her music for themselves. Each time she felt the same mix of nerves and excitement, the same rush of emotion that came from stepping into a space and transforming it with her gift. She began to realize that her life had changed. The restaurant, once a place of routine and invisibility, had become a stage. Not a stage in the sense of grandeur, lights, and celebrity, but a stage in the sense that she could express herself, be seen, and connect with others in a way that mattered. It was a power she hadn't known she possessed, one that had been quietly waiting inside her all along. One evening, a group of guests arrived who had heard of her talent from friends. They were from out of town, curious and excited to witness her music in person. The moment she approached the piano, the room seemed to hold its breath. She played as she always did, allowing the music to flow naturally, letting her fingers speak the words her voice could not. As she played, she noticed the reactions around her. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, feeling it in their chest and heart. Others leaned forward, mesmerized, unable to look away. The energy in the room was palpable, a shared experience that went far beyond entertainment. When she finished, the applause was immediate and thunderous. It was different this time, not just polite or surprised, but deeply appreciative. People were on their feet, clapping and cheering, some wiping away tears. The same room that had once been filled with judgment and skepticism had been completely transformed. A man approached her after the performance, his hands shaking slightly. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I've been to countless concerts, but I've never felt anything like what I just experienced. You changed how I see music, how I see life." She smiled softly, touched but composed. "Thank you," she said. "I'm glad it meant something to you." The experience reminded her that her gift was not just for herself. It was a tool, a way to reach others, to touch them in ways that went beyond words. She realized that music had the power to break barriers, to challenge assumptions, and to create connections that nothing else could. Over time, the attention she received grew. She was invited to play at small events, local gatherings, and even private celebrations. Each opportunity was different, but the feeling remained the same. The thrill of stepping forward, of sharing a piece of herself, and of witnessing the profound impact it could have. She also noticed how much she had changed personally. The fear that had once held her back, the doubts that had kept her from pursuing music fully, began to fade. She had faced the gaze of judgment, the sneers of mockery, and had emerged with her dignity intact. More than that, she had discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't realized existed. One quiet night after the restaurant had closed, she sat alone at the piano. The room was empty, the chandeliers dimmed, and the world outside seemed far away. She let her fingers wander over the keys, playing softly, without expectation or audience. The music was for her alone, a private celebration of everything she had accomplished and everything she had yet to explore. In that moment, she understood something important. Her journey was just beginning. The applause, the attention, the invitation, they were wonderful. But the true reward was the knowledge that she could step forward and create something meaningful, no matter who was watching. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a bridge to herself, to others, and to a life she had never dared to imagine. Weeks later, she received an unexpected invitation from a music academy she had once dreamed of attending. They had heard of her talent, her story, and the way she had moved audiences with her music. They wanted her to come and perform, to share her gift with students and teachers who would understand and appreciate it. She hesitated at first. The thought of performing in a more formal setting was intimidating, and doubt crept in. But she remembered the first note she had played in the restaurant, the way the room had changed and the courage that had carried her through. She knew she couldn't refuse. The day of the performance, she arrived at the academy, her heart racing but steady. The room was filled with musicians, teachers, and students, all eager to hear her play. She approached the piano, sat on the bench, and took a deep breath. Then she began. The first note, soft and deliberate, filled the room. She let the melody unfold naturally, her fingers moving with confidence and grace. The music carried emotion, story, and honesty, touching everyone present. Students leaned forward, their eyes wide with wonder. Teachers nodded appreciatively, recognizing the depth and skill in her playing. By the end of the performance, the room erupted in applause, standing ovations, and heartfelt cheers. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment and joy. This was more than recognition. It was connection, understanding, and validation of years of hard work, sacrifice, and courage. The experience reinforced what she had already learned. Talent was nothing without courage, without the willingness to step forward and share it with the world. And she had done that not just once but repeatedly, transforming spaces and hearts with her music. Returning home that night, she reflected on her journey. From the quiet waitress who had served tables with a hidden dream, to the woman who had silenced rooms and inspired people, she had grown in ways she could never have imagined. The piano had been her companion, her voice, and her guide, and she knew it would continue to be all three for the rest of her life. She sat at the piano in her small apartment, letting her fingers explore freely, playing not for anyone else but for herself. The music was a reminder of everything she had overcome and everything she had yet to accomplish. She smiled, feeling a quiet, profound satisfaction, knowing that her journey was far from over, but that she had already discovered the true power within her. The city outside continued to hum, full of life, lights, and possibilities. Inside her, a melody played, a song of courage, resilience, and hope. And she knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it, ready to create, and ready to share herself with the world in ways she had only just begun to understand. Her story had begun with a single note, hesitant and uncertain, and had grown into something far greater than she had ever imagined. It had transformed a room, changed lives, and revealed the quiet power of courage and authenticity. And as she played into the night, she realized that this was only the beginning of a life shaped by music, heart, and unwavering determination. She paused for a moment, letting the final notes fade into the quiet of her apartment. She leaned back, feeling the weight of her journey, the depth of her growth, and the promise of the future. She had faced doubt, fear, and expectation, and had emerged stronger, more confident, and more alive than ever before. And as the night settled around her, she knew with certainty that the piano would always be there, waiting, patient, and ready to help her tell her story. A story of courage, passion, and the extraordinary power of a single human heart daring to step forward.